Good morning, everyone. Going to talk about some weed issues in flax. We don't have a lot of weed control options, but there are a few, and even one that I wasn't aware of until recently. If I can get, okay. So herbicides label for flax, soil applied herbicides, and given that the flax is not a real competitive crop, we really need a soil applied herbicide to take out some weeds out of the flax so that we're not relying solely on the only two products post-emergence that we have. We do have a couple of options here. One in the fall, Treflan. And if you look at the Treflan label, it says flax and flaxseed, fall application only. Of course, the rate is determined based on your soil texture. We generally have medium soil, so probably for most people, it's going to be 7.5 pounds. The one I was actually not even aware of until recently, and we need to add it to the weed guide, is Sonalan. So right here we see flax is listed under oilseed, and it says apply and incorporate Sonalan 10G before planting. So I take that as a as a spring application. For some reason, the label says application may be made in the fall or in the spring prior to planting canola or cranberry. So I'm not exactly sure why the label specifies a fall application before canola, but it doesn't have a fall application before before flax. But anyway, so it does say apply and incorporate Sonalan before planting. And again, medium soil, about 7.5 pounds. The other herbicides, Callisto is labeled applied pre. Spartan and Spartan Charge are also preferred to be applied pre. So with our other options, post-emergence, we really only have two. Bronate, which is our, and I use the term bronate, but we know that the herbicide bronate, I don't believe exists anymore. So it's just generic bronate, bromoxynil MCPA, and then of course curtail M. For grasses, we have select or clethodim, assure 2, and post as options. What I consider probably our main herbicide for weed control in flax, I would consider Spartan generally as the main workhorse for controlling broadleaf weeds. And of course, in flax, we have to choose our Spartan rate based on soil characteristics. Coarse soil, medium texture, or fine soil. So if we're generally medium, 1.5 to 3. I think most soils are probably in there, at least in the western part of the state. Eastern part of the state, you might be a little bit higher. So the label calls for a medium soil 3.75 to 6 ounces. And of course, the label calls for if you have a pH less than 7, you can use the high end of the rates. If you have a higher pH, you'll use the lower end. We have seen that flax is very tolerant to Spartan. We have applied much higher rates than this, and it's been safe, but follow the label. But usually flax or Spartan is going to be, I think, the workhorse generally. The primary weeds that Spartan is going to control for us, Spartan is definitely the best kochia product that we have, and kochia is probably at least number 1 or number 2 on the most important weed list. Lamb's quarters, pigweed, wild buckwheat, Russian thistle, nightshade. The wild buckwheat, we have to tend to use a little bit higher rates to really get buckwheat control. The lower rates, we can miss a little bit. But we can come back post-emergence with a Bronate if we have to, if the Spartan does miss some wild buckwheat. And Bronate will get buckwheat, but it has to be small. You get 4 or 5 leaf buckwheat, and even Bronate will miss it. Callisto is a herbicide that is labeled, but I haven't used it a lot in trials. I haven't heard of a lot of growers using it, but it is labeled. It is a different mode of action. It is used for pre-emergence. Notice I have here, these are the weeds that are controlled or suppressed as a pre-emergence to the weeds. And this is a list of weeds controlled post to the weeds, not post to the crop. So Callisto is not labeled post-emergence to the crop. It is only labeled either pre-emergence or post-emergence to the weeds. So once the crop is up, you cannot use Callisto. It does call for or claim suppression of kochia, lamb's quarters, prickly lettuce, mallow, nightshades, pigweed, ragweed, shepherd's purse. So these are weeds that haven't emerged yet. For those weeds that have emerged, claims wild buckwheat suppression, horseweed suppression, kochia suppression, lamb's quarter, pigweed, mustard, ragweed, sunflower. So this list is similar to what you'd get from Bronate. However, of course, this is before the crop emerges again. Okay, so what are the most problematic weeds in flax? These are the weeds that I think that I get the most questions on, what I think are the most important weeds. Kochia, again, probably our biggest problem. We should get good control, good to excellent control of kochia with Spartan or Spartan Charge, assuming we get an activating rain. The Callisto label, again, as you saw, claims suppression of kochia. And then Treflan, Sonalan, and these are generally going to be used in conventional tillage, but if you're applying this in the fall, you could use it in no-till as well. But you'll get what I would probably call this suppression of kochia with Treflan, Sonalan, but it is a different mode of action. Pigweed, I think, is a weed that tends to come through. If there's a weed that I've seen that may tend to come through Spartan, I see it more often with pigweed coming through Spartan for some reason. And so I think pigweed is a big challenge for us because pigweed post-emergence is not easily controlled with Bronate or Curtail M. If we are going to try to control pigweed with Bronate, it's got to be really small, like 2 inches. Curtail M is not going to be very good on pigweed. We're going to have to get it with Bronate when it's really small. If you're applying Bronate to 4-inch pigweed, you're going to miss it. Wild buckwheat, again, we should get some suppression on or control with on buckwheat with Spartan Charge or Treflan, Sonalan, and then again with Bronate on wild buckwheat. If we apply it when the buckwheat has 2 to 3 leaves max, I think we should get decent control on the buckwheat. Fortunately for Canada thistle, Curtail M is our best option. Certainly a Roundup burn down prior to the crop emergence, but then post-emergence, if we have to, we can come back with Curtail M. Eyeless green foxtail is a problem in flax, primarily because of resistance that's showing up across the state. And we certainly have seen a lot of resistance with Assure 2, not as much resistance with Select, but because of the widespread use of Assure 2 in the past, we have a lot of resistance to Assure 2. Some of the things that we have to take into account for how effective our herbicides are going to be: rainfall for incorporation. Obviously, for any of these soil applied herbicides to be effective, we have to have rainfall for incorporation. Weed size and weed density certainly do matter. Again, as I've said, the pigweed size, kochia size, wild buckwheat size, when you're applying Bronate to these weeds, they need to be small. Again, for kochia and pigweed, for weed size, I would say 3 inches is your target weed size. For wild buckwheat, no more than 2 to 3 leaves. And then, of course, when you've got high weed density, you want to use maybe a little bit higher spray volume and try and get better coverage over those weeds. Now, the challenge that we have with spraying on small weeds is we may potentially, we hope that our soil applied herbicide will help us in controlling those late weed flushes. Other weeds of importance, but fortunately are controlled. I've got a list here: weeds controlled by Bronate and Curtail M, horseweed, marsh elder, ragweed, nightshades, sunflower, Russian thistle should be controlled by either one of these, Bronate or Curtail M. Weeds controlled by Bronate: kochia, pigweed when they're small, mustards, lamb's quarters. Any of the perennials such as Canada thistle, dandelion, perennial south thistle should be controlled by Curtail M. Wild oat, post-emergence, if you're going to use Select, make sure you're using Select at the full rate and preferably prior to tillering. For pre-harvest desiccation, we basically have 3 options: a glyphosate, Sharpen, or Valor. Glyphosate should be applied when the seed moisture is 30% or less with a PHI post-harvest interval of 7 days. Of course, do not use on flax grown for seed. Sharpen, 70 to 80% of the bolls should be brown, PHI of 7. Also do not use on flax grown for seed. Valor, 70 to 80% of the bolls should be brown, PHI of 5 days. Note that the Valor label does not say do not use on flax grown for seed. So Valor could be an option there. And of course, Sharpen and Valor, when applied as a desiccant, should be applied with AMS and MSO. We have done some testing with glyphosate and Sharpen as desiccants. There's obviously not a lot of leaf material there, and so it's hard to get a good burn down because you don't have a lot of leaves to burn. But this can be effective. Your best friend in a desiccation situation is going to be the temperature. If we have warm temperatures, this glyphosate and Sharpen are going to be much more effective. Now, down the road, in a year or two, we expect Reglone or Diquat to be labeled as a desiccant. And that study went through IR4 here a year or two ago, and so it's going to be another year or two before we get that as a label, and that would definitely be a benefit to us, especially if someone is hesitant to use glyphosate or can't use glyphosate for some reason. It'd be helpful to have that Diquat label. Just want to mention weed resistance and short rotations. Whether you, I don't think anybody does a flax wheat rotation generally, but we see less resistance developing where we have more crops in the rotation, whether it's a canola wheat, soybean wheat, or wheat pea. In some of our experience that we've seen over the years, it's taken about an average of 7 years for resistance to develop in a scenario where we are just using rotation, such as soybean wheat. In some cases, we've seen kochia resistance developing in as low as 5 years, might be 7 years, might be 9 years, but we want to avoid that if at all possible. I mentioned earlier that green foxtail is, or can be an issue in flax. And certainly wild oat could be too, depending on where you're at. Wild oat seems to be a greater problem in the eastern part of the state. Green foxtail may be a greater problem in the western part of the state. In the last 4 years, we collected wild oat and green foxtail samples. These were not randomly collected. These were samples that were sent to us by agronomists and farmers who suspected resistance. Of the 153 wild oat samples that we tested, 76% of those 153 were resistant to Puma. That's a pretty high percentage. However, we know that we've been using Puma for decades, and so it's maybe not completely unexpected that we have that higher resistance. Only 38% have been resistant to axial. So in your wheat crop, if you've got resistance to Puma, there's a good chance you may still be able to use axial. We do see that. We are seeing a lot more group 2 resistance, 72, 77, 87% resistance to our group 2s, 53 to Raptor, 75. I mentioned high resistance with Assure 2. 75% have been resistant to Assure 2, 6%, only 6% to Select. With green foxtail, 59% resistant to Puma, 43 axial, 62 with Discover. Puma and Discover pretty much mirror each other generally. Starting to see a little bit more resistance with the group 2s on green foxtail. With Raptor, we've yet to find any that are resistant to Raptor, so Clearfield crops could be an option here where you use Beyond. 41% have been resistant to Assure 2, only 1 with Select, and none where we combine the Assure 2 and Select and Roundup. That's all I have. Open to questions if there's time.